Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera. Today's video is another instructional video, and in this video I'm going to be showing you how to do a simple overhaul to a Canon P rangefinder camera. In this video we're going to be disassembling and cleaning the viewfinder and rangefinder assembly and then adjusting it. Next we're going to clean the slow shutter speed escapement, and this should fix your camera if the slow shutter speeds are not working or are running too slow. And the last thing is I'm going to show you how to free a shutter which doesn't close all the way or doesn't close at all. A common problem with these cameras is that when you fire the shutter, the second curtain doesn't quite close all the way, leaving a gap which allows light to come through and expose the film. For this particular job we don't need a lot of tools. Basically we just need some screwdrivers, an assortment of different size slotted tip screwdrivers, and we need a pointed tool like this lens spanner. You can buy one of these, or you can fabricate something like this with a pair of needle nose pliers with the tips sharpened, or you can use a pair of tweezers with the tips sharpened. We don't need this for heavy duty work. This is just to remove a couple of the small parts on the camera. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. The first thing we'll do is we will remove the lens and set it aside. Next thing we'll do is we'll turn the camera so it's sitting upright, and we'll remove the film winding and shutter charging lever. Use a pointed tool to remove the screw on the top. Underneath the screw is a spacer with a square center. Below that is a compression washer, and under that is this bushing. So I set these aside in the same order which I remove them. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the shutter button. So what we'll do is we'll set the shutter button so the bulb setting or B setting is pointing at the mark. And this will line up the three different screws so they can all be removed. I'm using a 1.1 millimeter slotted screwdriver. You can get one of these on Amazon for $1 or so, an inexpensive one. If you're only going to use it one time, an inexpensive one is perfectly fine. Okay, and then that lifts off. There's quite a lot of dust and stuff under this camera. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the collar which fits around the shutter button. And I want to be careful with these set screws in here. I only want them loose enough to lift it off. I don't want to take them all the way out because they're small and easily lost. And if you take them all the way out, then they're kind of a little bit difficult to put back in. I'll come out just a little bit more. When you take off the collar that goes around the shutter button, check for spacers here. Some of these cameras have spacers and some of them don't. If it has a spacer and you misplace it, when you put the collar back on, you're probably going to find that you can't get it to turn between the A and release marks. It'll jam up. So if it has a spacer or a small washer, it's critical that you put it back on before you put the collar back on the camera. Alright, the next thing we have to do is remove the film rewind lever. And this is something you have to be very careful on. On most cameras you would simply just stick a screwdriver through the fork and then twist the rewind lever counterclockwise until it comes off. You can't do that on a Canon P. There's a set screw which must be loosened. If you do not loosen this set screw before trying to take off the rewind knob, you're going to break off the threaded end of the winding arm, and then you're going to have to find a replacement. And they're not easy to come by. Okay, and I'll screw these back together so they're in one piece. Now, this camera is quite old and dirty, but surprisingly the shutter curtains don't have any wrinkles, which is really rare for one of these cameras. Usually Canon P and Canon 7 or any of the old rangefinders with metal curtains, they usually have a lot of dents in the shutter. Next thing we're going to do is remove the rangefinder window here. The top cover will not come off if it's still installed. So I take off the protector ring here, or trim ring, and then we have to pop out this lens. This lens here, you rotate to adjust the horizontal, or excuse me, the vertical adjustment on the rangefinder. There are a couple of slots in here which you can use to adjust it with. You put in a pointed tool and you turn this one way or the other to adjust the vertical adjustment. And it pops out like so. And then underneath there's a nut which must also be removed to get the top cover off. Once again, I'll use my pointed spanner to take it out. Okay, careful not to drop. Alright, and then we have to remove the cap screw which covers the horizontal adjustment. It kind of threads deeply into the body of the camera, and if you don't remove it, the top cover will not come off. The next thing we have to do is remove the flash sync socket, and once again I'll use my pointed tool. It's kind of an odd system for mounting the flash on these cameras. They require a special kind of bracket and adapter to run the flash. Okay, the next thing we have to do is remove the screw on this side which holds on the top cover. And the last thing we have to do is remove these 4 screws here on the top of the flash shoe. That one's a little bit too big. Okay. I'll go ahead and set these in here. Alright, and that is all the hardware which holds on the top cover. Once you remove all these pieces, you simply lift up on the cover and it pops off. Okay, so we've got the top cover off, and next we're ready to start cleaning the optical components inside the viewfinder and rangefinder. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start cleaning out the lenses and prisms and such in the top of the camera. To do this, you're going to need a couple of things. You're going to need some quality lens cleaning fluid. I use Fujifilm lens cleaning fluid. It's not expensive or hard to find. It's available on Amazon. You're going to need cotton swabs. I prefer to use pure cotton swabs. I buy these here at the 7-Eleven here in Japan for I think about $3 for a box of 200 of them. And the next thing you're going to need is a pair of pliers. I use these to squish the top of the cotton swabs flat, or to twist them at angles so I can get into places I otherwise couldn't reach with them. So I'm going to move the top cover aside here, pull this back just a little bit, and I'm going to do a quick inspection here to make sure that nothing is missing and everything is intact. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this lens on the back. This is made of optical plastic, not glass, and it's glued onto the back of the camera. And this contains the frame lines for the different lenses, and this also moves when you focus the lens. So I'm going to check and make sure that it's moving when I depress the follower, and it seems to work okay. I'm going to look around the side because this is glued on, and sometimes the glue comes off of these and the lens is just floating around here and it's not lining up properly. If it's floating around, you can glue it back in place, and you can tell where it goes just by looking at the lines where the original glue was. So I put a drop on top, bottom, and on both sides, but being very careful not to let it get anywhere where it's going to interfere with the movement. Alright, and then the next thing I'm going to do is look for fungus. There's a bit of fungus here inside the prism on the beam splitter, or reflecting mirror here. That actual beam splitter is in the main prism. But otherwise it's not so bad. To be able to clean properly, we have to be able to get into the inside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this block of glass in the middle, and I'll use my larger screwdriver. There's glue which holds these screws on to keep them from loosening up. You can use glue, or you can use a few drops of lacquer paint or nail polish to hold them on. And this lifts up, and this is pulling off a light baffle. Some Canon Ps come with these light baffles, some do not. So if you don't have a baffle in yours, don't worry about it. And I need to remove this block of glass. These are usually glued in place, but with just a little bit of lacquer or something on the bottom. So I just pry it slightly on one side, and that will usually knock it loose. And then I'll very, very carefully lift it out, like so. And looking at the back, there's a little bit of fungus on the inside of this one, but nothing major. A little bit of dust and dirt on the inside, but so far not so bad. I've seen much worse in these cameras. So the next thing to do is start cleaning up the glass components, and I'll start by doing the easier outside parts. Be very gentle and start first on the optical plastic lens here on the back, and make sure to use a very clean cotton swab, because these can be scratched easily if you're not careful. And then I'll go ahead and clean the front of the main prism. When I clean these, the front and back, I can look through and see how clean they are on the inside. And as I've mentioned before in other videos, I have a ceiling lamp behind me, and it's reflecting off the glass, and the way it reflects, I can see the surface of the glass very clearly, and it allows me to clean it off very neatly. Alright, the top cover is cleaned up quite nicely, so let's go ahead and get everything put back together. So I'll go ahead and slide the top cover down. These usually fit kind of snugly, so they have to be worked down just a little bit, like so. Okay, and the next thing we'll do is we'll start putting on the hardware. Just clean the dust out of the flash shoe here. To make this easier, I'll go ahead and drop the screws in the screw holes. It's kind of difficult to do this, line these up when like put the shoe on and then put in the screws one at a time. It's easier just to drop the screws in first. And then set it down, but not quite all the way, and start the screws. And then snug them down. And be careful to hold the screwdriver vertical and use it carefully so it doesn't slip out and scratch anything and leave tool marks. The next thing to replace is the ring here, the collar which goes around the shutter button. I'll go ahead and polish the inside a little bit. Okay, nice and clean. And I took it off with it lined up with the A mark, so I'll put it back so it's pointing in the same direction. And then tighten the set screws, like so. It's like our dog is a little angry at the moment. Okay, and then check to make sure that's working, turning fine. Alright. The next step is to put on the shutter button. I will go ahead and line it up so that it's set to the bulb setting. And then tighten the screws. Okay. Next I'll put on the film winding and shutter cocking lever. And spacer on the inside should fit over the square shaft on top of the camera. Tighten it with the pointed tool. Don't let the points slip if you don't want to scratch anything. Next we'll replace the film rewind knob. There's a detent on the inside which engages this slot cut in the knob. In order for it to fit down inside, we have to push the detent down. So I'll use this small screwdriver to do that. You can see it if you look inside the camera. All right. I'll put the fork back in here. Get it not very snug, just tight is okay. And then tighten the set screw. Go ahead and close the film door to protect the shutter curtains. Then we'll reattach the flash sync socket assembly. And tighten it down using the tool. The next thing we have to do is put in the nut here in the front. And the slots should be facing upwards. I hold it down so it fits flush and use my slotted screwdriver to start it. And I'll turn it until it bottoms out and then snug it down with a pointed spanner. Blow out any dust. And the next thing is the vertical alignment lens. I'll go ahead and clean the inside of it. I don't want to clean the outside yet because it's going to get dirty as I adjust the rangefinder. I put it in so the slots are generally in the same direction they were when I removed it. I won't replace the screw or the bezel cover yet, because next I need to adjust the rangefinder. So what I'll do is I'll take my lens and I'll reinstall it, and then to make the infinity adjustment, I will use my small screwdriver and adjust it in here. And for the vertical adjustment, you adjust that by turning this lens left or right. I usually turn it just by pushing carefully one way or the other and focusing at something which is very far away. So outside my window, about maybe less than a mile away, is Tokyo Tower, and that's usually what I use to focus on when I'm adjusting the rangefinder and viewfinder on these cameras. So anyway, that's it for adjusting, or how you adjust. I'll do the final adjustment later on, but the method of adjusting is just, this is the horizontal adjustment and this is the vertical adjustment. And when you're finished, you attach the last of the hardware. Make sure to use the right tool. And then the very last screw is the one on this side. Okay, so the viewfinder and rangefinder is crystal clear, nice and clean, and it should work really nicely. So the next step is going to be cleaning the slow speed escapement in the shutter mechanism. So let's take a break for a moment and then get started on that. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started. Once again, we're going to remove the lens, and we're going to be removing some hardware. All the hardware we're going to remove is on the front. We have the 4 screws here which fit around the lens flange. We have 4 more screws which hold on the body shell, and we have to remove the self-timer lever. Once we remove these, we can remove the body shell, and that will give us access to the slow speed escapement. So what I start with is with the self-timer lever, and using my pointy tool I'm going to remove this screw in the center, being careful not to let it slip and scratch the screw. Now when I remove the self-timer lever, it's going to wind, or it should wind, to the end of its travel, like so. And there are 3 screws which hold on this bezel here. I'll use this kind of small tip or fine screwdriver to remove these 3. There are 2 black screws and the silver screw. The silver screw goes on the bottom, the black ones go to either side. Okay. So inside this piece there's a kind of intermediary shaft with a slot on the end and a square on the front. Normally when you take this off, this intermediary shaft is left sitting on the camera. It may come off like this one, or it may be sitting. Whatever the case, it has to be removed. Inside here you can see this rectangular I guess end of the shaft, self-timer lever shaft. There's a compression washer behind that, so keep an eye on that washer and make sure that it doesn't get lost. The next thing we're going to do is remove these 4 screws around the lens mounting flange. I use a high quality screwdriver for this because I want these to not to get damaged. So I have like a dovetail screwdriver. I think it's K-Swiss or something like that they sell here in Japan. You can get them through Japan Hobby Tool, which I think has a store on Amazon. I usually leave these in place. There are 2 different sizes. There are short ones which go on the bottom, and there are long screws which go toward the top. These are held in with lacquer, or are locked in with lacquer, so sometimes it might be a little bit difficult to get the screwdriver to fit in the screw, but just push it into the lacquer and it'll come off. When I take this off, there are shims located behind. You can see them here. Sometimes the shims will stick to the body of the camera, sometimes they'll come off, sometimes they'll be on both places. Be very, very careful with these shims. Don't damage them, and if they do come off, they have to go on in exactly the same place they came off. This one has a complete circular shim. Sometimes there will be a half a shim on one side, or on 1/4, or on the bottom. Just keep a note of where the shims are and make sure that they go in the exact same spot. Take a photo with your cell phone to be sure, in case you don't trust your memory. And there are no marks on the Canon P lens flange like there are on a Canon 7. So I'm going to make sure that I put this down in a position so I know which is the top and which is the bottom. There are 2 more screws which go underneath the lens flange. These have to come out. And then we need to remove these 4 screws which hold on the body shell. These are painted black. They're very easy to identify. Okay, so all the hardware is off, and now we're ready to remove the shell. And to do that, simply open the film door and just pull the shell off the camera body, and we have the whole mechanism on the inside. There's also a good opportunity to clean out the inside of the film chamber in places which you can't normally reach. So, go ahead and wipe this off. Alright, I'll close that and set it aside. Here we have the self-timer mechanism, and in the bottom here we have the slow speed escapement. And to clean this up and get it working is very, very easy. All you have to do is first select one of the slow shutter speeds. I'll say 1 second. Take some lighter fluid. Put a couple of drops, just a little bit, and just operate the shutter. Alright, that sounds quite good. Everything looks really nice in here. Like the top. The outside of the camera was quite dirty, but the inside is really nice. Go ahead and blow any dust out. And I'll go ahead and clean off the trim around the black paint on the front of the camera. Alright, putting it back together is quite simple. Set the shell on like so. Close it and latch it like so. And start with the 4 screws which hold on the shell, the ones which are painted black on the ends. And screw them in. I always do this in a crisscross motion. When I was in high school, I took a auto repair shop or auto shop, and one of the things we did in the first year was rebuild an engine, and we learned about something called torque sequence. And using the proper torque sequence, make sure that everything is pulled up evenly and prevents any gaps. And then the 2 screws which go underneath the lens flange. Oh, wrong hole. Yeah, Auto Shop was a fun class. I really loved it. Okay, and I took off the lens flange when the camera was in this position, so I'm going to make sure I have it in the same position, so I put it in the right spot. The two longer screws go on the top. And the two shorter ones go in the bottom. Okay, and once again using a crisscross pattern, I'll tighten these screws or torque them down. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is put the self-timer back together. And as I said earlier, silver screw goes on the bottom. And the two black screws go on either side. Okay, the last thing to do is put on the self-timer lever, and there's kind of a trick to this in order to get it to go right, because when I pulled the lever off, you notice that it traveled on a little bit longer and then came to a stop. So what I have to do for this to work properly is I have to clock the self-timer lever back like 45 degrees or 90 degrees, and put it back on while the self-timer shaft is moving to get it in the right spot. So to do that, I'll just pull it back like this. That. Oh, didn't quite do it. Let's try it again. Okay. See if that's in the right spot. I'll go ahead and charge it up. Okay. Okay. All right, and that's it. We've cleaned the slow speed escapement. The slow shutter speeds sound good. 1 second, half second, quarter second, all good to go. All right, so we'll go ahead and take a break for a moment. And the last part, I'm going to show you how to unstick a shutter curtain that's not closing all the way. All right. So let's go ahead and get started on the last part. So we're going to be working on the bottom of the camera this time, and we're going to use the pointed tool to take off this black nut. And next we're going to take off these two screws on the other side. And then we will unlock the back, and then we have to remove the bottom cover. Sometimes it comes off easily, sometimes you have to pry it off. If you have to pry it off, you would pry it between the end of the hinge here and the bottom, and over here it would be right on the edge on this corner, but this one seems to be lifting off without giving me any grief. So I'm going to go ahead and charge the shutter. And when the shutter curtain is not closing all the way, the following curtain, it usually means that this shaft here is stuck, and possibly this part as well. And to free it up, I simply put a couple of drops of lighter fluid and cycle the shutter, and that will free it up. And then the next thing I want to do to make sure that it stays free is that I'll add just a little bit of oil under here and under here, and that will prevent it from sticking again in the future. Another problem that these cameras have is sometimes the 1/1000th shutter speed doesn't work, and in order to do that you have to tighten up usually the leading shutter curtain. And what you would do to do that is you would unlock these catch pawls on the front, which hold the shutter speed lock nuts in place. Loosen that a little bit, and you need 2 screwdrivers to do this job. You put a screwdriver in the slotted end of the silver shaft, and the other screwdriver you use to turn the lock nut. So if I wanted to get the 1/1000th speed shutter working properly, I would tighten up the tension on the lead shutter just a little bit. So I would unlatch it, and then I would turn it leftwards just a little bit, and then push the lock nut to lock it in place, and then push the pawl back and then lock it down. Luckily the 1/1000th speed is working on this one, so I don't have to tamper with it. But there isn't really too much to these cameras. It's a very simple design and not at all difficult to work on. When I'm done, I will put it back together. One thing to keep in mind when you take off the bottom cover, sometimes there's a spacer on the bottom. And you want to have this spacer there, because if this fits too closely, sometimes it'll interfere with the door opening and closing. The film door opening and closing. So, go ahead and reinstall these screws here. Alright, and then the last step is putting the nut back on here. Alright, and this camera is done. The viewfinder and rangefinder is cleaned and adjusted. The slow speed mechanism escapement has been cleaned and works properly, and I also showed you how to clear up a problem with the shutter which doesn't close all the way, and also how to speed up the shutter a little bit if your 1/1000th speed isn't working. That's it for this video. If you'd like to see more videos about vintage Japanese cameras in the future, please subscribe. If you're interested in purchasing a vintage Japanese camera, I sell these in my Etsy and eBay stores. Please check the description below the video for links to my stores. I'll have this Canon P available for sale, and I'll have another one ready shortly, and I'll be also adding different kinds of cameras over the weekend. So please drop by if you want to see what I have available. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you tune in again soon.